Synopsis. In a city that remembers people by the objects they leave behind, Mira, a once celebrated visual artist, is commissioned to do something impossible, create a single picture prompt that fits exactly the whole story it represents. Haunted by a choice that cost her a life she cannot claim and driven by a stubborn hunger to be honest on canvas, Mira gathers fragments of memory, an old kite, a moth-stained ribbon, a wooden boat made by a small, calloused hand, and drags them through alleys of light and absence. Along the way she meets Layla, a young woman who believes the past is a photograph she never had, Elias, the gallery curator who believes in the economy of absolutes, and Fard, the filmmaker who once left with Mira's ambitions and returned with regret. As the picture takes shape, memories and lies converge, the city closes in, and the single image becomes a crucible. It must either imprison the truth or set it free. The tale examines art's hunger to hold time, the cost of choices, and the way a single image can be a map, a wound, and, ultimately, a doorway to reclamation. When Elias first said the words, he said them with the same earnestness he used when he showed her other people's paintings and told her why they mattered. He reached across Mira's studio table, an old sewing table stolen from a theater prop room, and placed his palm over hers, as if sealing a promise with cartilage and warmth. "One picture," he said. "One image that fits exactly the whole story. Not one that hints, not one that invites a dozen lies. Exact." The light in the studio was the kind that decided things, a vertical strip of late afternoon in the narrow high window. Dust motes busy like pale fish. Mira watched them spin and wondered how you could ever make a single, absolute thing. No one had managed it. Not in stories she trusted. A photograph could freeze a gesture, but it could not tell why a gesture was made. A painting could hold an emotion, but not the calendar of small betrayals that had led to that emotion. Nonetheless, the commission came with a number that made her heart quicken. A sum measured in months of rent and studio heat, and the kind of recognition that made other galleries invite you to speak. It also came with a smaller, unspoken clause: if she failed, the gallery would quietly use her work as a cautionary piece in a show called Artists and Their Limits. Mira had been younger once. Her early work had been like the inside of a clock, everything visible, everything precisely placed. The poet's hand on the table, the mouth pinned between lines of prose, a small boat floating in a basin of glassy light. Critics called it lucid. The same clarity had taught her how to let love become a subject rather than a shelter. She took chances that cut, and she left, and light went on without her. She had returned to find a city with the same crooked skyline, but with fewer friends and more detritus, frames of old shows leaning against dumpsters, names of former lovers written on café napkins that blew into gutters like pale flags. Elias, who ran a gallery with the narrow, sympathetic windows of someone who loved other people's risk more than his own, proposed a show called Prompt, a single image. 5 artists. One artist would be asked to create the image. 5 writers would each write the story that the image demanded. Elias explained it as an experiment in authority. His voice, placid and cultured, insisted that sometimes a picture could be a decree. "You have a way of making things look like they remember themselves," he said. "I want you to try to guide memory back into an image. Make a prompt that leaves nothing to omission." Myra heard this and tasted iron. She wanted, for the right price, to set a trap for memory. A trap delicate enough to catch the truth without tearing it. And she wanted, selfishly, to be the one who could prove that a single image could hold a whole life. She began with an inventory of objects, the way a mason might measure bricks before he builds. The list read, like a confession, a blue ribbon, faded at the edges, a paper kite with a long tail, a child's wooden boat stained by riverweed, a photograph with the corners eaten away by humidity, a moth with one wing torn, a small brass key, whose teeth were worn down into a soft of patience. She found some of them in thrift shops, some in her childhood house, where her mother kept jars of dried buttons, some in people's pockets when she offered to barter a painting for a story. On a morning that smelled of rain and petrol, a young woman came to the studio. She was supposed to be a model. Elias had suggested Mira work with a living subject to root abstractions in bodily truth. But when Layla stood by the window, she seemed like a place Mira thought she'd remembered, a recess of a room where laughter used to live. Leela was dark-haired, eyes like coffee that had cooled, and she carried in the palm of her hand a photograph Mira'd seen before, but couldn't place a child with a kite face turned away toward a river. The photograph had a blue stain at one corner, the same blue of the ribbon Mira had tucked into a drawer the night her life shifted. "You don't have to show me anything," Leela said. Her voice was small but not unused to being heard. "I need a job, and I need to know if you'll put me in the photograph. If I'm in the photograph, I can then write the rest. I keep a list of things I want to understand about myself." Mira looked at the photograph and felt ready to die and live in the span of a single heartbeat. The child in the photograph had knees caked with river mud, one hand bent, as if holding a string. On the back of the photograph, in faded pencil, someone had written, in a hand Mira knew as intimately as the bones in her wrist, a date and a name. That handwriting was the memory she had not had the courage to look at for years. But she did not ask the obvious question, which would have been the worst kind of vanity. Instead, she studied Lila's hands, the way her knuckles swelled slightly when she glanced at the photograph. There was a small white scar near Layla's left thumb, a crescent of healed skin. Mira had years ago sewn a mismatched button onto a cardigan with her own needle, and the needle had nicked her finger in the same crescent. The studio smelled like turpentine and wet wool and something older, a long, slow forgetting. So, the work began with arranging things on the table and then moving them again, as if the objects themselves were actors rehearsing a play. Mira painted a narrow alley, not the grand boulevard of postcards, but the kind of lane that collects human errors like dust. Sunlight slanted in, gold and merciless. She placed the kite on a clothesline, tangled gently, its tail frayed. Below it, a small wooden boat sat in a shallow puddle, its reflection broken by wind. On the step of a stoop, a crumpled photograph lay curled, face down. A woman, seen from behind, stood in the threshold, one hand on the doorframe, the other holding a blue ribbon at her waist. There was a moth pinned to her sleeve, not preserved but alive, wings slightly bloodied. A brass key hung from a nail in the frame of the door. When Mira layered these things together on canvas, she was trying to compress a shifting, long story into a single frame. The kite was not just the kite, it was the promise of flight and the tangle of attempts. The boat was not only a toy, but a vessel of escape and of the childish, clumsy way humans attempt salvation. The moth was not merely an insect, but all the small deaths that attend desire. The photograph on the step was the proof that someone had loved enough to make evidence. The key was the possibility of return or the ache of being locked out. "These are all very good symbols," Farhad said when he arrived at the studio 3 days into the work, like a ghost with a camera bag. He had the same smile he'd worn the night he left Mira to go make a film about a war that lasted longer in rumor than in fact. His presence pulled at Mira in ways she had thought were settled. Seeing him in the doorway was like hearing a familiar melody that always ended wrong. "You can't make the image solve the story for people," he said. He moved his hand over the canvas like someone feeling a map. "If you make it too explicit, it becomes a didactic machine. But if it's too coy, Elias will say it invited misreading, and that's what he's afraid of." Mira felt the words as both challenge and consolation. She painted Lila into the image quietly, not as a specter, but as someone suggested by gesture, a pair of shoes on the doorstep, a braid falling from the threshold into shadow. She added the blue ribbon into the composition because when she tied that ribbon into a braid years ago, she had thought she was only making a pretty thing. The ribbon in the painting would fold like a hinge between two moments. Night came and went. Mira slept in the armchair, waking to the sound of the city that was not the same as it had been in her childhood, but still heavy with repetition. A dog that decided the moon was worth barking at, a late night bus that whistled past like a passing lesson. She found that the work forced memory into narrative, and then made it reveal itself like a shy animal. Sometimes the past behaved like a patient child, showing its face and then turning away. Other times it came violent and immediate, a voice on a street corner, a turn of phrase that suddenly belonged to a person long gone. Lila visited often. She brought tea in a chipped pot and told small things. She had grown up in a house by the river with an aunt who liked to count knots in rope while humming to herself. She had never known her parents. She collected photographs the way other people collected stamps. She liked to say, over and over, that a photograph was like a pebble. You could throw it into a pond, and it would cause ripples in many directions. The photograph you have, she told Mira one afternoon, is not a map. It's an echo. The map is the knot in the kite's tail. Mira wanted to laugh and cry in the same motion. She had been trying to make a map, to draw lines from one memory to another until the story had a highway crediting its turns. But here was Leela, offering her a different object to orient by. A knot, a thing meant to hold. Knots were small and technical. They implied sustained effort and the possibility of undoing. Once, while she worked, Mira retreated into a memory that had been wrapped in shame and left like a package with no recipient. She had been 27, and the city had been new. She had painted for hunger and for praise, and she had met Farhad, who told her that what she did on canvas could move like film and reach places that still pictures could not. He'd wanted to film her life, and in making room for his film, she made less room for other things. There had been a child then. A small, astonishing presence that fit into the hollow of her ribs like a tiny compass. But Mira thought her ambition needed air, and so she let the child go to be kept by someone who loved the child in a different currency, stability. She said the right words at the time and then closed the door because she told herself that returning would be for the wrong reasons. That art required sacrifices. She had never reconciled the truth of sacrifice and the selfishness of it. Her hands, when painting, remembered stitches and lullabies. The sensibility that made her good at composition also made her unable to forget the weight of an abandoned cradle. The image she painted did not need to carry apologies, but it demanded honesty. The week before the unveiling, Myra found a thread in the most unlikely place in a library's discarded envelope of letters. Inside, under years of dust, was a note in a handwriting she knew to the marrow. It was a short thing, written to someone named L, a promise that a small wooden boat would be left by the river on a certain day, and that the writer would be there at dusk. The signature was a name Mira had not seen since the last letter she had written herself with the same shaky certainty. A name that made the air in her chest thin. Mira. She had written to her child once, on a paper so thin the ink had bled like a map of the heart. She had left the letter folded under a brick in the garden, thinking that someone would find it, and that it would make sense. She could never go back and reclaim that moment. Time would not open to let her pick up the letter and be forgiven like that. Yet here, in the library, the echo of her words was a kind of proof that saying something aloud could lay a trail. When she brought the found note to Leela, the younger woman's fingers trembled like a bird's. "Where did you get this?" she asked, and the noise in the room dropped into a private place, like the click of a lock. In the library's overdue shelf, Mira said. She had never planned to return to the scene she'd abandoned. She had not intended to tell Layla that she had once been the kind of person who left letters under bricks, not because she wanted forgiveness, but because she wanted to leave evidence. Layla read it twice, 3 times. In the margin she found the date her aunt had told her about in the story of a storm the year it came late. The 2 dates fit like the teeth of 2 combs. For a long time, they sat looking at the lines on the paper, as if the paper were a map and their fingers were counting the roads. "You make paintings of things that can hold weight," Layla said finally. "But you're afraid of making them hold the weight you carry." Mira would have liked to deny it. Instead, she adjusted the muth on the painted sleeve, made the ribbon a touch brighter, worked the reflection in the puddle until the boat looked less like a toy and more like something someone might climb into. Fist tightened around the candle of grief. She painted till fingers ached. The canvas was a kind of confession stitched in oil. The night before the opening, Fard came with a camera and a bottle of wine. "Don't make it too literal," he warned again. "The image should invite, not arrest." "Maybe I don't want to invite," Mira said. "Maybe I want to show people the doorway and tell them the lie that there's only one right way through." "Art isn't a courthouse," Fard said, and his voice was gentle, but the room heard the way he had left. "It's a conversation." They argued about what a picture could hold, and the argument in Mira's chest was loud and unnecessary. She slept fitfully, dreaming of a kite stuck in barbed wire and of her child, unnamed, sitting on a riverbank with a kite that would not fly. Morning came thin and the gallery white and alive. On the pedestal under the gallery light, the canvas looked both correct and insufficient. The way a photograph of a beloved face can feel like the face and like a fraud. Ilias had asked, in his curatorial statement, that the artist writes a single line prompt to go with the image, the equivalent of a title, where titles had been a code. Mira had always resisted titles. They were like giving a final word to something that still wanted to sing. But for Ilias's show she provided one line, and she wrote it with the same deliberate stroke she used on canvas. Her prompt read like this: "A woman returns, and on the step of the alley she finds the proof of what she left. A kite with a frayed blue ribbon, a child's wooden boat in a puddle, a moth with one wing, a photograph face down." Elias read the prompt and nodded as if it were a prayer he recognized. 5 writers sat in a small room behind the gallery, each given the image and Mira's single sentence. They wrote stories that night, each different, each true to a heart. Because the image, when placed in front of a person, demanded that the person bring themselves to it. That demand was not a failure, but a revelation. No single image could entirely dictate the story of those who looked. The opening night hummed with the unsteady music of polite applause and cheap wine. People circulated, their eyes moving over the canvas with curiosity that flickered between hunger and hesitation. Some saw a woman who had been unjustly abandoned. Some saw a woman who had been brave to go and leave. Some saw themselves in the boat's reflection. A few stood long and whispered, as if decoding their childhoods like language. Lila came late, drawn by a need that felt more like a magnet in the chest than an appointment. She stood before the canvas, and less than a minute passed before she fell backward into a chair, breathless. Her hands fanned the air as if to quiet a bee. Mira, who had been talking to strangers about the technical way she had painted water, felt an acute tenderness for the young woman like a knife folding. "You put the moth there," Leela said. Her voice had a tremor that was not all from surprise. "You put the key in the doorframe. The photograph. It's face down, but I can see the corner. The ribbon. That is the ribbon." Mira's throat closed. She had not meant to be literal in the way that would announce her guilt to the room like a bell. But some small, terrible geometry had arranged things so Lila, and she shared the same signature of symbols. The gallery had become a stage where private things could be announced publicly without malice. "You were always the one to paint doors," Layla said. "People told me your work taught things to hold. I painted doors because I wanted to know who had keys," Mira said. She was not sure whether she had the courage to admit the rest. "I painted doors because I wanted to find the person who could open the one in my chest." Lila's eyes searched Mira's face with the vigor of someone trying to name a map. Then she produced the photograph from her pocket, the same one she had brought to the first sitting, and turned it over. On the back, under the faded pencil, were the letters Mira had seen 100 times in her sleep. The date matched. The tiny note Mira had left in the library folded under a brick looked like a trivial coincidence. Before the photographs, handwriting made it a claim. "You wrote this," Layla said. "I found this once in an old wall. I always thought it was a ghost's handwriting. I thought ghosts kept better promises." Mira wanted to sink into the floor. The room spun, and she could hear Farhad's voice at the edge of it, like a soundtrack she had once agreed to and then refused. There was no theatricality in the discovery. It washed upon them both like tide. People around them shuffled, not knowing whether to intervene or to let the domestic weather pass. "I left," Mira said. The announcement was small and comedic and catastrophic. "I thought I was making room for art. I thought I could make a life that would be neat and then come back. I was wrong." Alayila's face, in the gallery light, was the middle distance between grief and relief. "I know," she said. "I heard a story about a woman who left a boat. My aunt told it, and she made it sound like a fable. She said the woman would return, that the boat would be like a promise." "You should have seen me," Mira said. "I thought I would return with a more interesting story." "Perhaps you did," Lila offered. It was not a full reconciliation. The gallery did not dissolve into a cinematic reconciliation with violins and confetti. Instead, what followed was careful and small. A private conversation in the back of the gallery, the kind you have when the rest of the world is politely sipping white wine and reading wall text. They talked about the note under the brick, about the wooden boat left by a river, about the days when life seemed like a single path, and then decided to multiply into choices. Lila was angry sometimes in small, precise ways. She asked why Mira had not come back sooner. She asked about the nights she'd imagined a woman who left and then never returned. She asked whether Mira had been afraid. Mira told her, truthfully, that she had been afraid of failing as a mother and as an artist. She had chosen the wrong fear to obey. Farhad hovered in the background, more contrite than Mira had a right to expect, asking questions that started like apologies and softened into offers. A documentary, he proposed, about Lila's and Mira's shared story. That would involve cameras again in a way that felt dangerous to Mira. At first she said no, because cameras and the power to shape a narrative had been how she had justified leaving. But in the days after the exhibition opened, she found herself thinking of film as a kind of mirror, once used recklessly, now possibly a tool for repair. Elias watched them with the faint, pleased smile of a man who had given a board game to someone and then quietly stood back to watch them discover the rules. "You made people bring themselves to it," he said to Mira the night the crowd thinned. "You didn't rob them of their interpretations. You made a place where truth is possible." That phrase, "made a place where truth is possible," was a doorway with a thin light beyond it. Mira did not need absolution. She needed the ability to live with the choices she had made without letting them calcify into a myth about her essential selfishness. That would take time and patience and the willingness to be boring sometimes. It would also require the kind of bravery that involves steady, domestic things showing up at an aunt's apartment with a small wooden boat she'd mended, learning to make tea in ways that smelled like forgiveness. Leela, for her part, did not instantly accept Mira as mother or as owner of the blue ribbon. She required the lived test of a person who could be present in small, ordinary ways. She wanted to see Mira in dull moments, waiting in long lines for the post office, fumbling with a kettle, being awake at 3 in the morning to listen to an old radio. She wanted to know that Mira would be there when boredom asked for the same kind of courage as drama. The painting, once it had been seen, continued to do its quiet work. Strangers who had not known the private geometry of Mira's choices saw instead their own fibers. The moth that had gotten too close to a lamp, the boat that had been the first place someone learned to row. People left the gallery with an urge to call someone, to mend a relation, to dig up a photograph, to tie a ribbon. A few months later, Myra found a second note tucked inside the gallery's mailbox. It was from an aunt, in handwriting that had been taught by long practice with the necessity of economy. She had written, "If you would like to meet L. somewhere that is not an exhibition, come to the river on the 12th at dusk. Bring the boat." Myra went. She had painted many boats before she knew how to be in one. This time she climbed into a vessel that smelled of pine and old varnish and set her hands along the oars. Leela was already there, waiting as if she had been carved out of patience. The river was flat and wide, the banks a line of dark trees. The boat rocked gently, and somewhere a dog barked. They sat facing each other, not in a tableau but in a small, ordinary circle. Lila handed Mira a ribbon, faded but strong. "You sewed this into my hair once," she said. I remember the way it smelled. I painted it into the picture because I thought maybe if I made it hold, you would know where to find it," Mira said. She did not promise everything that was impossible to promise. "I can only offer this. I can only show up." "That will be something," Leila said. She tied the ribbon into a knot around Mira's wrist like a makeshift bracelet. It was not a binding in the fairy tale sense. It was a knot meant to hold the small weight of an ordinary day. "It's a start." Myra looked at the river, at the small boat that kept them afloat. She had spent years trying to create an image that would be a courthouse for truth, a single frame that would stop the dizzying possibilities of memory and name the right one. In the end, she understood a different logic, that images do not fix the world, they tilt it in a way that can reveal the seams. They are not solutions but invitations. The picture she had painted had not held the whole story like a locked chest. It had been a door with a key, and a moth, and a ribbon, and someone else had to choose whether to pass through. Later, when critics wrote about the show, they used elegant formulations and imported philosophers to make sense of the experiment. Some praised Mira for the daring of asking one picture to hold a life. Some said that the image succeeded precisely because it refused to be literal. A few, more blunt, said she had made a clever composition and left the rest to happenstance. Mira paid little attention. She had been given, and had given, something else, a shared point from which truth might be coaxed. She kept the ribbon at her wrist as a reminder. She learned to answer small calls, to show up for tea, and to sit through quiet hours where nothing dramatic happened. She learned how to make a boat hold two people without capsizing, how to sew a moth into a shadow without wishing it dead. The painting remained in the gallery for months, and visitors continued to stand before it, adding their own small stories to the room's hum. Sometimes Mira would come by and sit at the back and watch a child point and ask their parent what the picture meant and watch the parent invent a tale on the spot. Once she saw a man in too large coat cry quietly in front of the boat, unseen, He was reading the canvas like an old atlas and mapping his own losses. In time, the knot around Mira's wrist frayed a little and was re-tied. The ribbon's blue was less bright and became a comfort like a familiar song hummed under the breath. She had not created a single, literal answer that fit exactly the entire story. She had made, instead, a place for stories to converge and for truth to be found in the patient work of showing up. On quiet nights, she would sit at her window and think of the alley she had painted. The slanting light, the kite snagged on the clothesline, the boat in a puddle that reflected both sky and the underbelly of clouds. She would remember Ilya's calm voice, Farhad's hesitant regret, Lila's careful questions, and she would tell herself the odd and fragile truth that art is not, in the end, a thing that must prove the artist. It is a way of returning. The last line of the single prompt she had written hung in her notebook like a seed. A woman returns, and on the step she finds the proof of what she left. That proof, she had learned, was not a verdict. It was an offering, a photograph, a ribbon, a boat. People might look and choose to read it as absolution or accusation or nothing at all. What mattered was that there was now a place where the story could be told honestly, again and again. Each time a little different, each time inching them both towards something like home.